I used to think my life was set. Everything I believed, everything I followed, was as certain to me as the sun rising in the morning. From my earliest memory, my days were filled with the same familiar sounds, the call to prayer echoing through the neighborhood, the rustle of my mother's scarf as she prepared for worship, my father's calm voice reminding me to always keep my faith strong. I never questioned any of it. Why would I? This was my life. This was my truth. Or so I thought. But there comes a day you never prepare for, the day you realize that what you thought was solid begins to feel uncertain. I didn't see it coming. One moment I was following the path I had always known, and the next, I was standing still, my heart pounding in my chest, staring at something I could not explain away. I remember the way my hands shook that day, how the room felt strangely quiet even though people were speaking around me. It was as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to respond. But I couldn't. I couldn't find the words. I couldn't even find my thoughts. All I could feel was this strange heaviness pressing against my chest, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing that my life would never go back to the way it was. In that moment, every prayer I had ever whispered, every verse I had memorized, every lesson I had been taught, flashed through my mind like pages turning too fast to read. I wanted to hold on to them, to keep them as they were, but deep down I knew I had just stepped into something that would change me forever. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still see it, the look on the stranger's face, the way their words cut through me, not like an attack, but like a light pushing through a closed curtain. I remember feeling angry at myself for even listening. I remember telling myself to ignore it, to push it away. And yet, I couldn't. Something had lodged itself deep inside me, something I didn't ask for but couldn't remove. What I discovered that day left me without words. It took away the certainty I had built my whole life upon. It left me standing on the edge of a truth I wasn't ready to face, but could no longer deny. And as much as I wanted to run from it, something inside me knew I would never be the same again. I grew up in a house where faith was not just a part of life, it was the rhythm that carried us through every day. My earliest memories are of waking before the sun, my mother's gentle hand on my shoulder, her voice soft but firm, telling me it was time to pray. The air was always cool at that hour, and the world outside felt quiet, almost like it was listening in. I would stand beside her, sleepy-eyed but determined, repeating every word I had been taught. I didn't understand all the meanings then, but I believed every syllable mattered. After prayer, the Quran would be opened, and my father would sometimes sit with me, guiding me through the verses. His voice was deep, steady, and reassuring. He spoke with such certainty, as if each word was a bridge that connected us directly to God. I loved those moments, not just for what I was learning, but because they felt like a secret between us, a time where I could see him not just as my father, but as my teacher. I wanted to make him proud, to show him I was listening, that I was absorbing everything he gave me. Our home was a place where modesty wasn't just about clothing, it was about the way we spoke, the way we moved, the way we looked at the world. My mother would remind me, even when I was very young, that a woman's beauty was a treasure meant to be protected. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was just the way things were. Scarves and long sleeves became as natural to me as breathing. The rules were not a burden, they were a part of my identity. Still, even in those early years, I sometimes found myself wondering about things I didn't ask out loud. I wondered why certain rules seemed stricter for women than for men. I wondered why some verses in the Quran sounded different depending on who was explaining them. I wondered why, when I asked certain questions, the answers came quickly, almost too quickly, as if the real conversation was being kept just out of reach. But those thoughts were fleeting then. I would quickly push them aside, telling myself that my understanding was small, and God's wisdom was greater. I was devoted. I prayed not just because I had to, but because I wanted to. I memorized verses because they felt beautiful on my tongue, and I followed the rules because I believed they pleased God. My parents looked at me with pride, and I carried that pride like a badge. Even so, somewhere deep inside, a quiet part of me was storing those unanswered questions, tucking them away in corners I never visited. I didn't know it then, but one day, they would all come rushing back at once. The first time I felt something shift, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a lightning strike or a moment of defiance. It was an ordinary afternoon. I was helping my father prepare for visitors, setting out tea and arranging cushions in the sitting room. The conversation between him and a neighbor drifted in from the doorway, and I caught a sentence that made me pause. They were discussing a woman in our community, someone I had always admired for her kindness, and the neighbor remarked that she had brought shame to her family because she spoke too openly about her opinions. My father agreed, adding that a woman's voice could lead men astray if she was not careful. It wasn't the first time I had heard such words, but for some reason, they stayed with me that day. I remembered moments when my own questions had been met with a quick change of subject. I thought of the times I had been told to lower my gaze, to keep my thoughts to myself, to leave certain matters to men. A small, stubborn part of me wondered why my thoughts should be dangerous, why my voice should be a threat. That night, I opened the Quran to a familiar passage I had memorized years ago. I read it slowly, hoping to find clarity, but the more I read, the more I noticed how different interpretations could lead to entirely different conclusions. I remembered hearing one version from my father, another from my teacher at the madrasa, and yet another from a visiting scholar. Each had spoken with authority, each had said their way was the correct one. But they could not all be right. I wanted to obey. I wanted to keep my faith pure and unquestioning. But the question kept returning, if the truth is so clear, why does it seem to change depending on who is speaking? I didn't tell anyone. I carried it quietly, tucking it away like the other questions before it. But this time, it didn't stay hidden. It was like a thread that had been loosened, and no matter how tightly I tried to weave it back into place, it kept slipping free. I prayed more earnestly in those days, asking God to forgive me for even wondering. I would kneel and recite the words I knew by heart, but sometimes they felt distant, like my voice was reaching upward and not finding its way back. I tried to silence the question, but questions have a way of growing louder when you pretend they're not there. Looking back, I think that was the first crack, small enough to ignore, but deep enough to mark the beginning of something I couldn't undo. It happened on a day that began like any other. I was walking home from the market, the sound of vendors calling out their prices still ringing in my ears. The air was warm, and I remember feeling tired from carrying the bags in my hands. As I passed a small corner shop, I saw an old man sitting outside with a stack of worn books laid out on a cloth. Something about them caught my attention. Most were in Arabic, but one was different, its cover faded, its title written in English. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe just the desire to rest for a moment. The old man noticed me looking and smiled. Without saying much, he handed me the book. "Take it," he said. "It's for you." I hesitated. I didn't know him, and I didn't want to invite trouble. But before I could refuse, he had already slipped it into my bag. When I got home, I placed it on my desk and didn't touch it for days. Something about it made me uneasy. I told myself it was unnecessary, maybe even dangerous, to read it. Yet every time I walked past, I felt my eyes drawn to it. Finally, one evening, I opened it just to see. The pages held stories I had never read before. Some were familiar in pieces, but told in ways that felt strange and unsettling. They spoke of God's love in a tone I wasn't used to, not as a distant judge, but as a father who sought his children. At first, I almost laughed. This can't be true, I thought. It sounded too gentle, too personal. It didn't match the God I had grown up fearing. I closed the book and reached for my Quran, determined to prove to myself that my faith was still unshakable. I read the verses I had always clung to, the ones that had guided me through doubt before. But this time, instead of reassurance, I found more questions. Why were certain events described differently? Why did the timelines not match? Why were the same names tied to such different truths? I wanted to stop thinking about it, but I couldn't. It was as if the book the old man had given me had opened a door I didn't know existed, and now the wind from that doorway was blowing through everything I thought was secure. I remember sitting on my bed one night, Quran in one hand, the other book in the other, feeling like I was standing between two worlds. I felt like the ground beneath me was shaking. I whispered to myself. My whole life, I had believed I was standing on a rock, unmovable, steady, safe. Now it felt as if that rock had cracks I had never noticed before, and water was rushing through them, washing away the certainty I had always known. The breaking point came quietly, almost without warning. There was no loud announcement, no dramatic scene, just a single moment that refused to leave me. It was late at night, the kind of night when the whole house feels heavier with silence. I couldn't sleep. My thoughts had been restless for days, circling the same questions, never finding rest. I kept telling myself that this was just a phase, that the unease would pass. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. I sat at my desk with the Quran open in front of me, the old man's book lying beside it. My fingers hovered over the pages, moving back and forth as if I could will the two to agree with each other. I read one, then the other, then back again. Each time, the differences felt sharper, no longer just small variations, but deep, dividing lines. My heart ached. I didn't want this. I didn't want to feel torn between what I had always known and what I was beginning to see. That night, I remembered a conversation I had overheard a few days earlier. Two men in the street were debating scripture, one Muslim, one Christian. The Christian's words were calm, almost pleading, but certain. He spoke about forgiveness in a way I had never heard before, not as something to be earned, but as something freely given. The Muslim man argued back, just as firmly, but the Christian's final words had lodged themselves in my mind: if you truly want to know, ask God himself. He will answer. I found myself whispering those same words into the stillness of my room. If you are real, if you are who you say you are, show me. Show me the truth, no matter the cost. The words frightened me as soon as I spoke them. I knew what no matter the cost could mean. It could mean losing my family. It could mean losing everything familiar. The hours passed slowly. I sat there in the dim light, scrolling through articles, comparing verses, reading testimonies of others who had left the faith I had always believed in. Some stories felt distant, but others hit me like a mirror, reflecting thoughts I hadn't dared to speak aloud. I didn't feel an immediate answer. There was no sudden voice, no vision. But something in me had shifted. By asking that question, by opening that door, I knew there was no going back. I felt the weight of it pressing on my chest as I lay down, knowing sleep would not come easily. My mind was wide awake, and for the first time in my life, my heart wasn't sure which side it belonged to anymore. The house was empty, and for once, I felt no rush to hide what I was doing. I had kept the old man's book tucked away under a stack of clothes in my wardrobe, afraid someone might see it. That day, I took it out and set it on the table. I opened to a page I had bookmarked weeks before but hadn't dared to read in full. The words were simple, but they struck something deep inside me. It spoke of a God who came close, not as a distant ruler, but as one who walked among people, felt their pain, healed their wounds, and laid down his own life for them. It wasn't a set of rules, it wasn't a list of conditions, it was a story of sacrifice and love. I kept reading, my fingers tracing each line as if I needed to feel the words to believe them. Then I reached the part that stopped me. It described Jesus speaking to those who doubted him, offering forgiveness even as they mocked him, praying for those who were hurting him. My breath caught in my throat. Forgiveness like that was something I had never truly seen before. I thought of my own life, of the sins I carried, of the times I had felt unworthy and tried to work harder, pray longer, follow more rules just to feel clean. And here, in front of me, was a claim that the price had already been paid. Not by me, but for me. A tear slid down my cheek before I even realized I was crying. My chest tightened, and I had to set the book down. I couldn't speak, because deep down, I knew. I knew this was the truth I had been circling around, the truth I had been too afraid to name. I sat there for a long time, staring at the open page, my mind racing through every possible reason to reject it. But each reason felt smaller, weaker, compared to the weight of what I had just read. It wasn't just words on paper. It was as if someone had been speaking directly to me, patiently, through all my doubt and resistance, waiting for this moment. The room felt still, almost heavy, but not in a way that made me afraid. It was the stillness of something sacred. And I knew, no matter how much it frightened me, I could never knowing the truth and acting on it are not the same thing. I learned that quickly. In the days after that afternoon, I carried the weight of what I had discovered like a hidden flame. It warmed me in moments when I was alone, but I kept it carefully shielded, afraid of what would happen if anyone saw it. Every time I thought about telling someone, even my closest friend, I felt a cold fear settle in my stomach. I imagined the look on my father's face, the quiet disappointment in my mother's eyes, the whispers that would pass through our community. I had seen what happened to others who stepped outside the boundaries. They were not just questioned, they were erased. I found myself praying more often, but the words were different now. They were not the familiar recitations I had been taught since childhood, but raw, stumbling whispers. God, I know what you've shown me, but I'm afraid. I don't know how to take the next step. I don't know if I have the strength to lose everything. At night, when the house was still, I would lie awake imagining two different futures. In one, I stayed silent, kept my faith as it appeared on the surface, and lived without conflict. In the other, I stepped forward into the truth I now believed, and everything familiar fell away. Both visions made my chest ache, but for different reasons. And yet, whenever I thought about embracing the truth fully, not hiding, not pretending, a deep peace would wash over me. It was unlike anything I had felt before, a quiet certainty that this was the path I was meant to take. But as soon as that peace settled in, the fear would return, sharp and heavy, reminding me of the cost. I was torn between that peace and that fear, pulled in opposite directions every hour of the day. Sometimes, I would close my eyes and imagine a life where following God didn't mean losing my family. Other times, I would simply sit in silence, feeling the tension twist inside me. It was in that tension that I realized something: the truth might set you free, but it will also demand everything from you. And I wasn't sure if I was ready to pay the price. The day I made my decision didn't arrive with fanfare. It was ordinary, the kind of day where you wake up expecting nothing to change. But somewhere between sunrise and sunset, the quiet certainty in my heart outweighed the fear in my mind. That evening, I waited until the whole house was asleep. I sat on the floor of my room with the curtains drawn, the old man's book in one hand and the Quran in the other. I read from both, the words on the page seeming to face each other like two roads going in opposite directions. My hands trembled, and my breathing felt uneven. But my choice was already made. I placed the Quran gently back on the shelf, my fingers lingering on its cover as if to say goodbye. Then I opened the book that had first shaken my world and began to read again, not as an outsider, but as someone stepping into the truth it offered. The verses felt alive this time, not just ink on paper. It was as if the words were reaching into the deepest corners of my heart, touching wounds I hadn't even known were there. When I finished reading, I walked to my mirror. My reflection looked the same, but I knew I wasn't. Slowly, I reached up and removed my hijab. I had worn it for so long that it felt almost like a second skin. My fingers hesitated, and my chest tightened as I set it down on the table. The room felt colder without it, but also lighter. I cried then, not because I was abandoning my culture or my family, but because I knew I was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. I thought of my father's voice in the early mornings, my mother's careful instructions about modesty, the years of devotion I had poured into a path I now knew I couldn't follow anymore. It felt like a farewell, one that left me both grieving and strangely at peace. I whispered into the stillness, I choose truth over fear, and in this moment, I am free. The tears didn't stop, but neither did the resolve in my heart. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew this: I could no longer pretend. I had taken my first step, and there was no turning back. As I look back now, it's hard to believe the journey I've walked through. From confusion to clarity, from fear to freedom, I've learned that the truth has a way of breaking through the darkest walls. I once thought I knew God, but now I know Him in a way that has changed everything about my life. It hasn't all been easy. I've faced loss, loneliness, and uncertainty, but I have found a peace that nothing and no one can take away from me. If you are searching for the truth, don't stop. Keep asking, keep knocking, and keep listening. Ask God to show you, no matter the cost, and be ready for the answer, because when He shows you, your life will never be the same. If my story has touched you, please share it so others can find hope too. Subscribe for more stories like mine, and let me know in the comments what your journey has been like. And most of all, I ask you to pray. Pray for those still searching, for those still afraid, and for those who are one step away from discovering the truth that changes everything.